There is a type of person who has the most detailed plans in the room, the clearest vision, the most passionate speeches about where they want to go in life. And yet, 5 years later, they are standing in the exact same place. They haven't moved an inch. And the worst part? Deep down, they already knew that would happen. If you recognize yourself in that description, or if you know someone like that, stay until the very end of this video, because what you are about to discover is not just a list of motivational tips. This is a psychological map of why brilliant, talented, ambitious people spend their entire lives dreaming and never actually building anything. And by the time this video ends, you will understand something that most people go their entire lives without realizing, something that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a man who, in 2002, sold a company he co-founded for $165 million. Most people in that position would retire, buy a house near the ocean, and spend their days in comfort. Instead, he took nearly everything he had and poured it into two companies that almost everyone told him would fail. One of them was trying to build electric cars at a time when nobody believed that was commercially possible. The other was trying to send rockets into space, something that even well-funded government agencies struggled to do reliably. He was told he was insane. He lost sleep. He nearly went broke multiple times. His closest friends advised him to walk away, and yet, instead of retreating into the safety of his bank account, he pushed harder, not because of blind confidence, but because of a specific psychological relationship with risk and discomfort that most people never develop. That man is one of the most studied examples in the world of what it looks like when someone doesn't just dream, but executes relentlessly. His story is not primarily about genius. It is about psychology, and that is exactly what this video is about. Most people assume that the gap between dreaming and doing is about intelligence, money, or luck, that some people are just wired differently, born with more drive, more courage, more discipline. But that is not what the science shows. Research in behavioral psychology has consistently found that the gap between intention and action is almost never about resources. It is almost always about the invisible mental patterns running underneath the surface, patterns that were formed long before the person ever had a single dream to pursue. Understanding these patterns is not just fascinating, it is for many people the difference between a life fully lived and a life fully imagined. The first thing psychology teaches about this phenomenon is something called the intention-action gap. It was studied extensively by researchers Peter Gollwitzer at New York University and Pascal Sheeran at the University of North Carolina, and what they found is both simple and profoundly disturbing. People who form strong intentions, who genuinely believe they want to achieve something and are committed to pursuing it, follow through on those intentions less than 40% of the natural conditions. Think about that number carefully. 6 out of 10 times, even when someone truly and sincerely wants to do something, they don't do it. Not because the goal wasn't real, not because the desire wasn't genuine, not because something external blocked them, but because the architecture of motivation inside their brain works very differently from what most people assume it does. Here is what is actually happening inside the brain of someone who dreams big, but never acts. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning, rational decision-making, abstract reasoning, and goal pursuit, is constantly in a battle with the limbic system, which governs emotion, immediate reward, and threat response. When a person sits down to imagine their big dream, the prefrontal cortex lights up with excitement. It starts mapping out possibilities. It starts projecting into a future version of reality. It starts calculating outcomes and potential. And for a few minutes, sometimes even a few hours, it feels absolutely incredible. The brain releases dopamine, the same chemical that is released when something genuinely pleasurable happens. And here is the trap that almost nobody talks about. The brain does not fully distinguish between the dopamine released from imagining achieving something and the dopamine released from actually achieving it. In both cases, the reward circuit is activated, which means that, for a certain type of person, the act of dreaming is neurologically satisfying enough to replace the act of doing. The brain receives the reward without requiring the behavior that the reward was designed to motivate. This was demonstrated in a rigorous study published in the journal Psychological Science in 2011 by Gabrielle Oettingen and her colleagues at New York University. Participants who spent time visualizing success on a task, specifically imagining the goal as already achieved, feeling the emotions of having succeeded, actually performed significantly worse than participants who either didn't visualize at all or who spent time thinking realistically about the obstacles they would face on the way to success. The group that fantasized freely reported feeling less energized, less motivated to take concrete steps, and ultimately completed less of the actual work. Positive visualization, in its most popular and widely recommended form, is not just ineffective. According to this and several subsequent studies, It can actively work against execution by draining the motivational energy the brain would otherwise direct toward action. And yet it remains one of the most celebrated habits in popular self-help culture. That gap between what the research shows and what is being sold to the public is itself a fascinating and troubling subject. What all of this tells us is that dreaming big, without the right psychological structure behind it, functions as a form of self-deception, not a conscious lie that a person tells themselves, but a neurological loop that allows a person to feel the emotional reward of success without ever being exposed to the discomfort of genuinely pursuing it. And discomfort is exactly where the real story lives. Because discomfort is not the enemy of achievement, it is the currency of it. Because what actually separates the person who executes from the person who only imagines is not willpower in the traditional sense. Willpower is one of the most misunderstood and most misrepresented concepts in all of psychology. The traditional model that some people simply have more of it than others, that discipline is a fixed character trait, you are either born with or you are not, has been largely replaced in modern research by a more nuanced and considerably more useful framework. Roy Baumeister's research at Florida State University on what he called ego depletion showed that self-control functions more like a muscle than a character trait. It can be fatigued, it can be trained over time, and most importantly, it can be structurally supported or structurally undermined by the environment a person creates around themselves. The person who dreams without doing is almost never lazy in the way most people imagine. They are often someone who has been unconsciously building an environment that drains their capacity for action, while simultaneously feeding and inflating their capacity for imagination. Think about someone you know who has been talking about starting a business for years. They have the idea, they have the passion. They might even have some savings sitting in their account, but they spend hours every week watching interviews with successful founders, reading books about entrepreneurship, studying business case studies, listening to podcasts about strategy and leadership. Every piece of content they consume feels like progress. It gives them the same neurological warmth as doing the actual work. They feel engaged, they feel productive, they feel like they are moving. But they are not doing the actual work. They are, in psychological terms, engaging in what researcher Alia Crum at Stanford's Mind and Body Lab calls preparatory behavior substitution, using the activities that feel like preparation as a permanent replacement for execution. And the more sophisticated their preparation becomes, the harder it actually gets to start, because now the gap between where they currently are and where they have imagined they should be before starting has grown so wide that beginning feels almost insulting to the vision they have built up in their mind. How can they possibly launch a minimum viable product when they have spent 2 years building a perfect mental model of a world-changing company? The beginning feels too small, the reality feels too pale against the dream, and so they wait for a moment that will never come. And here is something important. If you are still watching this, pay close attention to this next part, because this is where the psychology gets very specific and very personal. This brings the conversation to one of the most powerful and least discussed psychological forces behind chronic inaction, and it has a name that researchers use very precisely. It is called identity-based paralysis, and it works like this. When a person has a very elevated image of who they are going to become, the successful entrepreneur, the best-selling author, the world-changing innovator, the person who finally gets it right, they begin to unconsciously protect that future identity from the risk of being disproven. Because if they try and fail, the dream dies. The future self that has been so carefully constructed in the imagination is exposed as a fiction. But if they never try, the dream remains intact forever. The possibility of becoming that extraordinary person is preserved, protected, kept safe in the realm of the hypothetical, where no one can touch it. This is not cowardice in the traditional sense. It is a very sophisticated and psychologically understandable form of self-protection. The brain, which is evolutionarily wired to avoid threats to survival and status, treats the threat of a failed identity as seriously as it treats the threat of physical danger. James March, a professor at Stanford Business School, who spent decades studying decision-making behavior in organizations and individuals, observed that many highly intelligent people are especially vulnerable to this specific pattern, precisely because their capacity for imagination is so vivid and so detailed that the imagined failure feels almost as real as an actual failure would. The brain simulates the embarrassment, the disappointment, the loss of status so convincingly that it generates a genuine avoidance response. The person is not avoiding effort, they are avoiding the experience of a simulated loss that their own mind makes feel completely real. Here is something worth stopping on for a moment, because this next part connects everything together in a way that most people have never been shown explicitly. There is a specific type of thinking that high dreamers engage in almost constantly, and it is called counterfactual thinking. It is the mental habit of imagining alternative realities, what could be, what might happen, what would be possible if only certain conditions were met. Counterfactual thinking in moderate doses is healthy and adaptive. It is part of how humans plan, problem solve, and learn from past mistakes. But in excess and in the absence of actual behavioral steps, it becomes a psychological trap that feels exactly like ambition while functioning exactly like avoidance. A person trapped in counterfactual thinking will spend hours, sometimes years, sometimes entire decades, mentally rehearsing scenarios. They imagine the product launch going perfectly, the audience responding with enthusiasm, the critics praising the work. They imagine the conversation with the investor going smoothly and the funding coming through. They imagine their future self on a stage, in an interview, in the moment of recognition. And because the human brain is extraordinarily good at simulating experience, these mental rehearsals carry genuine emotional weight. The person walks away from these mental sessions feeling something that resembles the satisfaction of having done real work. They feel the faint fatigue of effort, even though no actual external effort occurred. Researchers call this phenomenon mental simulation fatigue, and it is one of the primary mechanisms through which people who think the most sometimes produce the least. The solution that psychology actually offers, not the oversimplified version sold in motivational culture, is something called implementation intention. It was developed and rigorously tested by the same researcher who first quantified the intention-action gap, Peter Gollwitzer, and it is strikingly, almost embarrassingly simple. Instead of visualizing the outcome, instead of imagining the finish line, a person specifies the exact when, where, and how of a very specific behavior, not the vague declaration, "I will start working on my business this week," but the precise mechanical specification, "At 9 in the morning on Monday, I will sit at my kitchen table, open my laptop, and write the first 3 sentences of my business plan." Just 3 sentences. Not a vision board. Not a mission statement. 3 sentences on a page. Studies show that this technique increases follow-through rates by between 2 and 3 times, compared to standard goal setting. Not because it adds motivation, but because it removes the decision from the emotional brain and places it into a behavioral routine that runs almost automatically. The action no longer depends on how the person feels that morning, whether inspiration strikes, or whether the conditions feel right. It happens because the architecture has been deliberately built to make it happen regardless of internal state. But even implementation intention has limits if the deeper psychological layer underneath it is never addressed. And that deeper layer is the story a person tells, constantly, quietly, usually without awareness about who they are. Identity, in modern psychology, is not just a background feature of a person's experience, it is the operating system through which all decisions are processed. Every action a person takes or avoids, consciously or not, runs through the filter of who they believe themselves to be at the deepest level. And most people who dream big, but do nothing, have at the center of their identity a self-concept that is fundamentally incompatible with the sustained, unglamorous daily behavior that execution requires. They see themselves as visionaries, as deep thinkers, as people who understand things at a level that others don't, as people destined for something significant. And in many cases, that perception is not entirely wrong, but the visionary identity and the executor identity require very different psychological postures, and they generate very different daily behaviors. The visionary looks outward and forward, scanning the horizon for patterns, possibilities, and grand narratives. The executor looks inward and downward at the specific, often boring, frequently uncomfortable, sometimes humiliating steps that must be taken today, with whatever imperfect tools and limited resources are currently available. When a person's entire identity is built around the visionary posture, execution feels like a demotion. It feels like settling, it feels beneath the magnitude of the vision, and so they outsource it, first in fantasy, then in the form of endless waiting for the right partner, the right team, the right moment, the right version of themselves, someone or something that will take their vision and finally make it real. Carol Dweck's decades of research on mindset at Stanford University captures part of this dynamic with great precision. People who hold what she calls a fixed mindset, the belief that intelligence and ability are stable, innate traits that you either have or don't have, are significantly more likely to avoid challenges that carry the genuine risk of failure, not because they don't want to succeed, but because failing would threaten the fixed identity they have carefully constructed around being capable, intelligent, or uniquely gifted. And for the big dreamer, the dream itself is often the most important piece of evidence they hold that they are exceptional. The dream is the proof. The dream is the justification for the sense of specialness. Letting go of it, or worse, attempting it, and watching it fall painfully short of expectation would destroy the primary thing they have built their self-concept around. This is why some of the most psychologically paralyzing dreams are also the most grandiose ones. The person who wants to change the world, disrupt an entire industry, or build something that has genuinely never existed before, is carrying a vision so immense that any ordinary first step seems laughably inadequate by comparison. And so they wait. They wait for inspiration. They wait for clarity. They wait for the moment when the circumstances will feel as monumental as the destination they have in mind. But that moment never comes, because the gap between vision and first action is not a problem to be solved before starting. It is the very terrain through which action must be taken. The gap does not close before you walk into it. It closes because you walk into it. Stay with this next part, because this is the piece of the psychology that changes everything when it finally lands. One of the most instructive examples of this in real life can be found not in the lives of the world's most celebrated successes, but in the lives of those who almost became successful, the people who had every apparent advantage and never crossed the threshold from potential to reality. Academic research on this subject, particularly the longitudinal work of psychologist Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania, has found that the single most reliable predictor of long-term achievement across vastly different domains is not intelligence, not raw talent, not social advantage, not access to resources, and not even the quality of the original idea. It is the capacity to remain engaged with uncomfortable, unrewarding, repetitive work for extended periods of time in the absence of external validation or visible progress. Duckworth calls this grit, a term that has since entered the popular vocabulary, and what her research shows is that grit is not a fixed personality trait distributed unequally at birth. It is a learned behavioral pattern that is almost always developed through early and repeated exposure to effort that was both genuinely difficult and personally meaningful. The person who was never allowed to struggle as a child, who was consistently protected from failure, praised not for working hard, but for being naturally smart, and taught implicitly that discomfort is a warning signal that something is wrong rather than a normal feature of meaningful work, enters adulthood with a brain that has not learned how to extract motivation and meaning from the friction of sustained effort. For that person, difficulty feels like a stop sign. It feels like confirmation that they are on the wrong path, that they are not ready, that this is not their moment. For someone who has developed grit through genuine experience of hard work and failure, difficulty feels like confirmation that they are on the right path, that the discomfort is evidence of growth rather than evidence of unsuitability. This is not about blame for the circumstances of one's upbringing. It is about honest, clear-eyed understanding. Because once a person sees this pattern clearly, once they genuinely understand that their relationship with discomfort, and not their lack of ambition or intelligence or opportunity, is what has been holding them in place, the entire problem reframes itself in a way that becomes actionable. It stops being a question of whether they want it badly enough, or deserve it enough, or have the right conditions. It becomes a question of whether they are willing to systematically and deliberately change their psychological relationship with the experience of trying, failing, adjusting, and trying again. There is a concept in cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most well-researched and evidence-supported forms of psychological treatment in existence, called behavioral activation. It was developed originally as an intervention for clinical depression, but its underlying logic applies with remarkable precision to the psychology of chronic inaction in people who do not have depression, but have simply built a pattern of perpetual preparation without execution. The core insight of behavioral activation is this: motivation does not reliably precede action. For most people, in most real-world situations, motivation follows action. The feeling of wanting to do something, the sense of energy and engagement and forward momentum, comes after doing it, not before, which means that waiting to feel motivated before starting is, from a psychological standpoint, waiting for a train that runs in the wrong direction. The train does not arrive at the station and then begin its journey. You have to be on the track before the train appears. You have to build the experience of doing before the feeling of wanting to do becomes consistent and reliable. Every person who has successfully built something from a dream to a functioning reality will describe some version of this experience, whether or not they frame it in psychological terms. The first days, first weeks, sometimes the first months were not exciting. They were awkward. They were confusing and humbling. The quality of the early work was poor. The gap between what they imagined producing and what they could actually produce in the early stages of effort was uncomfortable and sometimes painful. But they did not interpret that gap as evidence that they were not ready, or not good enough, or not cut out for it. They interpreted it as the completely natural and expected distance between the beginning of a journey and its destination, a distance that closes through movement, not through waiting. And they kept moving anyway, not because of extraordinary willpower or some genetic advantage in discipline, but because they had built habits, routines, and environments that removed the necessity of feeling motivated from the equation. They committed to showing up at specific times in specific ways, regardless of internal state. They made action mechanical before it became meaningful. And gradually through that mechanical repetition, meaning arrived. This is the fundamental distinction that psychology reveals between the person who builds and the person who only imagines. It is not talent, it is not intelligence, it is not luck or circumstance or access. It is the internal narrative around discomfort, the relationship between identity and execution, and the willingness, developed and practiced, not innate, to take unglamorous, imperfect, insufficient feeling steps on ordinary days when nothing about those steps feels remotely adequate to the size of the dream. That willingness is not a character trait, it is a skill, and like every skill, it is built through practice. Now, here's the part of this conversation that most content on this subject will never take the audience to, and it is the part that matters most for anyone watching this who has genuinely recognized themselves in what has been described. The psychological patterns behind chronic inaction are not permanent features of a person's character. They are not destiny. They are habits of mind, and habits of mind, unlike genetics or circumstance, can be changed through deliberate and structured effort, but they cannot be changed through motivation alone. They cannot be changed through inspiration, no matter how powerful the source of that inspiration is. Watching a video, reading a book, or attending a seminar, even an extraordinary one, creates insight. Insight is valuable. But insight is not behavior, and only behavior changes behavior. The first step in building the kind of psychological structure that bridges the gap between dreaming and doing, backed by extensive research from acceptance and commitment therapy, known as ACT, developed by Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada, is a practice called cognitive defusion. Defusion is the practice of stepping back from thoughts and observing them as events occurring in the mind, rather than as accurate reports about external reality. When the familiar thought, "I'm not ready yet," arises, and it will always arise, defusion teaches the person not to fight that thought, not to try to argue with it or replace it with a more positive affirmation, but simply to observe it as a mental event, to say internally, with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, "I notice I'm having the thought that I'm not ready yet." That subtle but meaningful shift in language creates a psychological distance between the person and the thought, a space that is large enough to prevent the thought from automatically, unconsciously converting into avoidant behavior. The thought is still there, the discomfort is still there, but the person is no longer fused with it. They can act in spite of it. The second step is what ACT researchers call committed action. Not action taken in the presence of motivation, not action contingent on having the right conditions, the right partner, the right level of preparation, or the right emotional state. Action taken in direct alignment with one's deepest values, regardless of how the internal psychological experience feels in that specific moment. This is the hardest step for the person who has spent years living inside a dream, because it requires them to act without the emotional fuel of inspiration, to work without the warm dopamine reward of vivid mental simulation, to do ordinary and often tedious work in the service of an extraordinary vision, without any guarantee, none at all, that the vision will ultimately materialize. But here's what the research consistently and reliably shows about what happens when people genuinely begin doing this. Within weeks, sometimes within days, of beginning consistent, values-aligned action in the presence of discomfort, rather than in the absence of it, the psychological experience of that action begins to change. The work that once felt overwhelming becomes familiar. The fear that once generated paralysis begins to generate something closer to focus. The identity that once felt fragile and threatened in the face of possible failure begins to be replaced by something considerably more durable, an identity not constructed around the dream of what one might become, but around the daily reality of what one is actually doing. That is a completely different foundation, and it holds weight in a way that imagination alone never can. That is the shift, the fundamental, identity-level shift that separates the builder from the dreamer. It is the movement from being someone who has a vision to being someone who shows up every day, imperfectly, insufficiently, by the dream's own standards, but consistently. From building a self-concept around a possible future to building it around current, concrete, observable action. And that shift, as counterintuitive as it feels at first glance, because it seems like a downgrade, like letting go of something grand in favor of something ordinary, is precisely what every person who has ever translated a big dream into a real outcome eventually and necessarily makes. Not as a compromise, as the method. There are people in the world right now who have been carrying the same vision for a decade, the same idea, the same plan, the same unmistakable fire in their chest when they describe what they want to build and who they want to become. and nothing has changed. Not because the vision isn't real, not because the desire isn't genuine, not because the external conditions have been impossibly hostile, but because the psychological architecture required to transform a vision into a sequence of uncomfortable, repetitive, unsexy daily behaviors has never been deliberately built. They have been waiting to feel ready, and the readiness they are waiting for is not coming, not as a feeling, not as a sign from the world, not as a moment of sudden clarity, because readiness is not a feeling that precedes action. It is a consequence of accumulated action. You do not feel ready and then start. You start, and through the experience of starting, of stumbling, of continuing anyway, of gradually improving, you begin to feel ready for what comes next. The most dangerous comfort zone in the world is not the one made of laziness or apathy. Laziness at least carries some degree of self-awareness. The person who is simply not working knows at some level that they are not working. But the person who is dreaming big and doing nothing often feels on a daily basis as though they are fully engaged in the project of their life. They are reading, researching, thinking, planning, refining, imagining, discussing. The hours feel productive, the mind feels active, the identity feels intact and even noble. But the calendar keeps turning, months into years, years into decades, and nothing in the world has actually changed as a result of anything they have done. The dream has not moved. It has only become more elaborately detailed and more psychologically comfortable. If that description is landing somewhere uncomfortable right now, that discomfort is not something to push away or minimize. That discomfort is data. It is the emotional signal that something honest and precise has been encountered. And the human brain has a predictable and reliable response to that kind of discomfort. It begins immediately generating reasons why the description doesn't quite apply, why the situation is different, why the timing still isn't right, why the next step requires just a bit more preparation. That response is not evidence of a character flaw. It is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting the current pattern from disruption. Recognizing the response for what it is, without being controlled by it, is the beginning of a different relationship with one's own thinking, not controlling thoughts, not eliminating discomfort, just seeing the mechanism clearly enough that it no longer operates entirely without awareness. Because here is the final thing that psychology teaches about the gap between dreaming and doing, and it is the thing that deserves the most honest confrontation. Knowing is not enough. Understanding the pattern, however clearly and precisely, does not by itself dissolve the pattern. Insight is the beginning of change, not its completion. Every person who has ever consumed content like this and walked away feeling deeply, powerfully understood and changed, and there are millions of such people, has had the experience of returning, sometimes within days, sometimes within hours, to exactly the same behavioral patterns as before. Because the brain is far more powerful as a pattern preservation engine than as a change generation engine. It will use every available tool, including the new insight, including the understanding of the mechanism, including the inspired feeling generated by this very video, to gradually and quietly return to the familiar. That is not a failure of character. That is biology doing its job. The only thing that actually breaks a behavioral pattern, at the level of lasting change rather than temporary emotional disruption, is behavior. Consistent, deliberate, chosen behavior in the direction of what matters most, taken not once, not when conditions are favorable, not after the next book or the next conversation that finally makes it all make sense, but now, today, imperfectly, insufficiently relative to the scale of the dream, with all the awkwardness and inadequacy and humility of a genuine beginning. The man described at the opening of this video did not succeed because he was smarter than every other person with a big idea. He succeeded because when the moment came to choose between the comfort of a secured, comfortable, respectable future and the terrifying, expensive, publicly humiliating, professionally risky process of building something that had never been built before, at a scale that had never been attempted, against odds that most rational analysis said were impossibly long, he chose the process, not once, in a single moment of heroic decision-making. Over and over and over again, on ordinary days, on days when the vehicles were catching fire during testing, on days when the rockets were exploding on the launch pad, on days when the money was nearly gone, and the press was mocking, and his closest advisors were urging him to accept reality. He kept choosing the process, not the dream, the process, because he had built a psychological relationship with discomfort and uncertainty that most people, for reasons that are entirely understandable and entirely addressable, have not been willing to build. That is the psychology behind those who dream and those who build. That is the real story underneath the inspiring biographies and the motivational quotes and the viral highlight reels. It is not determined at birth. It is not locked in by background or education or circumstance. It is available, genuinely, practically available, right now in this moment, to anyone willing to make one specific trade, the comfort of the imagined life for the difficulty of the actual one, not permanently, not all at once. Just today, in one small, insufficient, imperfect, real step. The dream is not the destination. The dream is just where the work begins, and the work is what makes a life. There is a study conducted at the Dominican University of California by researcher Gail Matthews that deserves more attention than it typically receives in conversations about achievement and motivation. She divided participants into groups based on how they handled their goals. Some people only thought about their goals internally, others wrote them down, others shared them with a friend, and others wrote specific action steps, shared them with an accountability partner, and sent weekly progress reports. The results were significant. The group that wrote goals and shared progress with someone was 65% more likely to have accomplished their goals by the end of the study period, compared to those who simply thought about their goals privately. That 65% gap was not produced by talent. It was not produced by having a better idea or more motivation. It was produced by structure, by external architecture, that made action more likely and avoidance more costly. This is the practical application of everything the psychological research points toward. The brain responds to structure, it responds to accountability, it responds to specificity, and it responds to the incremental building of evidence that the person doing the work is in fact someone who does the work. That last point deserves to be explored more carefully, because it connects directly to something most people experience without ever naming it. There is a psychological phenomenon called the spotlight effect, first documented by Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky at Cornell University, which describes the tendency for people to overestimate how much other people are paying attention to their actions, their failures, and their missteps. People believe they are under constant observation, that others are carefully noting every mistake, every awkward first attempt, every moment of visible struggle. In reality, other people are overwhelmingly preoccupied with their own concerns, their own anxieties, their own versions of the same internal battles. The audience for your failures is far smaller and far less attentive than the fear of visibility makes it seem. This matters because one of the most common reasons people delay starting, particularly on public-facing work like a business, a creative project, or a new professional identity, is the fear of being seen as they are now, before they have become who they intend to be. They want to debut fully formed. They want the world to see the finished version, not the process. But the finished version only exists at the other end of a long process of visible imperfection, and that process cannot begin until the person is willing to be seen in the middle of it. Imperfect, uncertain, learning in public. The fear of the spotlight is, in most cases, a fear of a spotlight that is barely even there. There is another deeply important concept that needs to be examined here, one that sits at the intersection of neuroscience and everyday psychology. It is called the planning fallacy, and it was first described by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two of the most influential researchers in the history of behavioral psychology. The planning fallacy is the consistent and systematic tendency for people to underestimate how long tasks will take, how much effort they will require, and how many obstacles they will encounter, even when those people have extensive experience with similar tasks and have been wrong in similar ways many times before. Every project feels, at the start, like it will be completed in a reasonable amount of time with manageable difficulty, and almost every project ends up taking longer, requiring more effort, generating more unexpected problems than the initial estimate predicted. For the person who dreams big but never starts, the planning fallacy manifests in a particular and especially tricky way. They have imagined the project in its completed form so many times that the timeline feels compressed in their mind. The path from here to there feels like it should be achievable in a matter of months, which means that any evidence suggesting it will take years becomes a reason to question whether it is the right project at all. Difficulty is interpreted as a design flaw in the plan, rather than a predictable feature of any meaningful undertaking. And when the first difficulty appears, when the first unexpected obstacle emerges, as it always does, the dreamer is not prepared for it emotionally, because the mental simulation they ran never included that kind of friction. The simulation was smooth, the reality is rough, and the roughness feels like a sign. Kahneman's research suggests a practical remedy for this, one that successful builders use instinctively, even without knowing its formal name. He calls it the outside view. Instead of estimating a project's timeline and difficulty based on the internal logic of the plan, a person asks a different question: how long did similar projects actually take for other people in similar situations? Not the plan-based estimate, the historical base rate. How long did it actually take the founders of companies in this space to reach their first significant milestone? How long did it actually take writers of similar books to complete and publish their work? How long did it actually take people attempting this specific type of career change to establish themselves in their new field? The outside view is almost always more accurate than the inside view, and more importantly, it immunizes the person against interpreting normal, predictable difficulty as a reason to stop. But knowledge alone is not enough, as has already been established. What a person does with this understanding, how it translates into daily behavior, is the only thing that matters. And here the conversation returns to a concept that cannot be overstated: the role of the immediate environment in shaping long-term behavior. Research by behavioral economists and environmental economist Stefan Wong-Com, psychologists, including the influential work of Brian Wansink on food environments and Wendy Wood on habit formation at the University of Southern California, has repeatedly demonstrated that the decisions people make and the behaviors they sustain are less the product of conscious rational choice and more the product of the environment that surrounds those choices. People eat more when food is visible and nearby. They exercise more when the gym is on their commute route. They do more creative work when their workspace is free of digital distraction, not because they decide to in those moments, but because the environment has been designed, deliberately or accidentally, to make those behaviors easier. The person who wants to start building the thing they have been dreaming about for years needs to stop asking how to find more motivation and start asking a different question entirely: what specific changes to my environment would make action easier and avoidance harder? Where would placing my notebook on my kitchen table before I go to sleep tonight make it more likely that I write something tomorrow morning? What phone settings would remove the apps that generate the comfortable, progress-feeling consumption that substitutes for actual production? What specific time would I block on my calendar, not as a wish, but as a non-negotiable commitment, for the one behavior that actually moves the dream forward? These are not inspirational questions. They are architectural ones, and architecture is far more reliable than inspiration as a daily fuel for behavior. There is a principle in behavioral psychology sometimes called 2-minute rule, made accessible by productivity researcher James Clear in his widely read work on habit formation. The idea is grounded in serious research on the psychology of initiation, the specific cognitive and emotional barrier that exists not between continuing a task and stopping it, but between not doing a task and beginning it. That initial barrier, the transition from non-doing to doing, is often the largest psychological obstacle in the entire sequence of behavior. Once a person has sat down and started, the inertia of the activity typically carries them forward. The resistance lives almost entirely in the moment before starting. The 2-minute rule addresses this directly. When beginning any important behavior feels too difficult to initiate, commit only to the first 2 minutes of it, not to completing the project, not to producing something worthy of the vision, just to sitting down and beginning for 2 minutes, after which the person is free to stop if they genuinely want to. In practice, stopping after 2 minutes is psychologically difficult. Once the behavior has been initiated, the brain shifts from avoidance mode to engagement mode, and continuing becomes easier than stopping. This is not a trick. It is a practical exploitation of how the human motivational system actually works from the inside out, not the outside in. And now, because this video has covered a great deal of psychological territory, it is worth pausing to address something that is present in the room for many people who are engaging with this content. There is a phenomenon in psychology sometimes called insight addiction, the pattern of repeatedly seeking and consuming understanding about a problem without ever translating that understanding into behavior. It is deeply common among intelligent, curious, reflective people. They find insight genuinely pleasurable. The moment of understanding, the sensation of a concept clicking into place, of finally having the right framework for something that has been confusing, is one of the most satisfying experiences the human mind can have, and it can, if a person is not careful, become its own form of the same trap being described throughout this video. Consuming insights about why you are not doing the thing becomes the substitute for doing the thing. Understanding the psychology of inaction becomes its own form of inaction. The antidote is not to stop seeking understanding, it is to impose a consistent, non-negotiable behavioral demand on every new insight. Every time something genuinely useful is understood, the question that follows must be, not "that's interesting, what else can I learn?" but specifically and immediately, what is the one smallest concrete action that this insight calls for, and when exactly am I going to take it? The insight serves the behavior serves the vision serves the life, in that order, and not in any other. Consider the concrete example of someone who has spent 3 years planning to write a book. They have a detailed outline, they have done extensive research, they have read dozens of books on writing craft, they know the structure of a compelling narrative, they can explain what makes a great first chapter, but they have never written one. The reason, when examined honestly, is almost never that they lack the knowledge to write, It is that they have built a complete and comfortable psychological world around being someone who is going to write a book, and beginning to actually write the book threatens to replace that comfortable identity with the uncomfortable reality of imperfect daily work. The outline is perfect, the first draft will not be. And the gap between the outline in their mind and the imperfect draft that would appear on the page if they started today is a gap they have been protecting themselves from crossing. What psychology prescribes for this person is not more preparation, not a better outline, not one more book on the craft of writing. It is a date, a time, a location, a document already open on a screen, and a commitment to write one imperfect, insufficient, below the vision paragraph, one, and then to notice what actually happens in the experience of writing it, which, for most people, most of the time, is not the catastrophe their brain predicted. It is the ordinary experience of doing ordinary work, difficult, yes, uncomfortable at times, yes, but survivable, and, with continued practice, gradually more familiar, and eventually more meaningful. The architecture of achievement is built from exactly these moments, small, unromantic, repeated acts of doing the thing, rather than thinking about the thing, day after day, week after week, month after month, in the absence of inspiration on some days, in the presence of doubt on others, through the periods when no visible progress appears to be occurring, and the voice in the head that says this isn't working grows louder and more convincing. Through all of that, and because of enduring through all of that, the thing eventually exists in the world that did not exist before, not because of a magical moment of clarity, or a flood of motivation, or the perfect alignment of circumstances, but because someone chose, repeatedly and deliberately, to act on the vision, rather than only carry it. There is a final psychological insight that ties everything in this video together, and it comes from an unexpected source, not the research on motivation or habit or identity, but from the study of meaning. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to develop logotherapy, one of the most profound psychological frameworks of the 20th century, wrote that human beings are fundamentally driven not by the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain as earlier theories assumed, but by the pursuit of meaning. He observed, in the most extreme possible conditions, that people who had a clear and deeply felt sense of purpose could endure almost any degree of suffering, and people who lacked that sense, even in objectively comfortable circumstances, experienced a kind of emptiness that no amount of ease or pleasure could fill. What Frankl's insight reveals, applied to the psychology of dreaming versus doing, is this: the discomfort of pursuing a meaningful goal is not the enemy of a good life, it is one of the primary ingredients of one. The person who protects themselves from the discomfort of execution by remaining permanently in the realm of imagination is not protecting their quality of life. They are, over time, gradually and quietly emptying it. Because human beings are not psychologically designed for unlimited comfort, they are designed for meaningful challenge, for the experience of moving towards something that matters, and encountering resistance and continuing anyway. The research on what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, that state of complete, energized engagement in challenging activity, confirms this. Flow does not occur in comfort, it occurs at the precise edge of challenge and capability, where the task is hard enough to require full engagement, but manageable enough to permit forward movement. That edge is not a place most people accidentally stumble into. It is a place built through deliberate, consistent, sometimes unglamorous action. The question that every person who recognizes themselves in this video eventually has to sit with alone, honestly, without the comfort of another insight to hide behind, is simply this: what is the cost, measured not in money or status, but in the actual texture of a daily lived experience, of continuing to carry the dream without moving toward it? What does another year of preparation feel like from the inside? What does another decade of the same conversation, with the same people, about the same vision, in the same holding pattern, actually cost at the level of a life being lived? And, on the other side of that question, what would it actually feel like, not at the imagined finish line, but on an ordinary Tuesday morning, to be someone who is doing the work, however imperfectly, however slowly, however far short of the vision the current output falls? That Tuesday morning feeling, not the imagined triumph, but the quiet, solid, identity-building reality of being in motion, is what the research consistently identifies as the foundation of both genuine achievement and genuine psychological well-being. The dream is real, the desire is real, the vision, in many cases, is genuinely worth pursuing. None of that is the problem. The problem, and the solution, live in the space between the last thought about the dream and the first movement toward it. That space is where psychology operates, and that space, narrow as it turns out to be when examined clearly, is where every life is either built or permanently postponed. There is one more dimension of this that rarely gets discussed openly, and it may be the most important of all for people in the second half of their lives. As people move through their 30s, 40s, and 50s, the psychological stakes of the undone dream increase in a very specific way. Earlier in life, there is an intuitive sense that there is time, that the dream deferred is the dream preserved, that the moment for beginning is always somewhere ahead on the horizon. But as years accumulate, a different psychological phenomenon begins to operate. Researchers at the University of Michigan, including Laura Carstensen, in her work on what she calls socio-emotional selectivity theory, have found that as people perceive their future time as limited, not necessarily because of age, but because of the felt sense of time becoming shorter, their psychological priorities shift in measurable ways. They become less interested in acquiring new information and more interested in meaningful experience. They become less tolerant of activities that feel empty and more drawn to activities that feel genuinely significant. What this means practically is that for the person who has been carrying a dream for 15 or 20 years, the cost of continuing to defer it is not the same as it was at the start. The dream does not sit still in the imagination. Over time it begins to carry the weight of everything that was not done. It begins to feel less like a possibility and more like an indictment, less like a vision and more like evidence, not of what is coming, but of what was consistently chosen against. And that shift in psychological relationship with the dream, from possibility to regret, is one of the most painful transitions the human mind can undergo. Not because the dream was unachievable, but because the person eventually has to reckon with the fact that it was achievable, and they chose repeatedly, in the quiet accumulated decisions of ordinary days, not to pursue it. This is not meant as something dark to end on. It is meant as something precise, because precision about the actual cost of chronic inaction is the only honest foundation on which a real decision can be made, not a motivated decision, not an inspired one, a real one. A decision made with full awareness of what is actually being chosen in each direction. The comfortable continuation of the imagined life, with all the neurological warmth and identity protection it provides, and all the gradual silent accumulation of unlived time it costs. Or the uncomfortable beginning of the actual one, with all the awkwardness and imperfection and humbling visibility of genuine first steps, and all the identity-building, meaning-generating, genuinely human satisfaction that only the experience of doing something real in the real world can produce. The psychology is clear. The research is consistent. The path is not hidden. What remains is not a question of understanding. What remains is a choice. One small, real, imperfect, immediately available action. Not tomorrow. Not after the next insight. Not when conditions improve, or the feeling finally arrives. The dream is not the destination. The dream is just where the work begins. And the work, imperfect and unglamorous, and entirely human as it is the life,